Hello, everybody. This is Tosca at NGO Soul+Strategy. So change management. It's a huge field of knowledge and practice, and I think it's difficult to put any kind of boundaries around it as a field. And therefore, it's also not easy as a practitioner to claim you actually know the field because it's so vast. There's also a big field of change management certifications, programs, etc., that offer detailed guidance on what change managers supposedly are supposed to go through. Often when I look at those, I'm thinking, I don't see any way that anybody has the time for that level of detailed practice, but I might be wrong in that regard. Anyway, in my case, in my change management advice, I've really learned more inductively about organizational change and how best to both lead and manage that through studying the experiences and consulting with NGOs, INGOs in particular, including some pretty big ones, and pulling lessons about that from that process. However, in comes Michael Randel, a consultant who I met through a mutual collaborator and friend. And today we will learn from Michael what he has learned from his practice in supporting change managers and change leaders across multiple sectors. And I look forward to this. Welcome, Michael.
Hello, Tosca. Thank you for inviting me today.
Yes, I'm looking forward to this because I know you know a lot about change management that I will be learning from in turn. So Michael's bio, dear listeners, he is the owner of Randel Consulting Associates. He lives in the United States, but there is another background coming that we'll ask about in a moment. He, amongst others, was a change consultant in the World Bank's Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness Department before he started his consulting company. He worked for a Danish development agency in Southeast Asia prior to that. And originally, he was an OD practitioner, so an organizational development practitioner in South Africa, which I understand is your native country, including during a phase in which Michael worked for a South African youth organization during the apartheid struggle. So Michael, tell us a little bit more about what I just summarized. Who are you and how did you get into this field of change management, which is, I think, endlessly interesting, but as I said, hard to put boundaries around?
That's such a juicy question you want to start with. And I'll take care so that my answer doesn't take up the rest of the episode. So, yes, I'm a straight, white, cisgender, middle-class, middle-aged male with English as a first language, university educated. Mm-hmm. So some of you may be thinking, gosh, he must be at the top of the privilege pyramid. And in many ways, yes, I am. And we also have our own stories. So my experience actually is that I was born in Ireland. And in the late 60s, when I was born, Ireland was a very poor country. Yeah. And my father could not find employment there. And so we moved several times around the world to different countries as he followed his career.
Interesting.
So I had the experience of growing up as what nowadays people sometimes call a global nomad or a third culture kid. But yes, then ended up in South Africa, where I did where I finished up my schooling and then went to university. So I would say my university studies were really where I really began to understand the privileges that I had, the context in which I was living. And it's really where I, at the university, then began being exposed to and grappling with change management. And in very sort of short ways, I was at what was then called the University of Natal. That university, along with a few of the other English language universities in South Africa in the middle 1980s, began to admit Black students. This was against the law. Apartheid required that the different races, so-called races, had to be educated separately from each other. But these more liberal campuses decided that this was no longer tenable. They were not going to go along with the law, They began to admit black students to the campus. So when I started there, they had just begun that experiment the year before. And I happened to be at the university for 8 years. Over that time, essentially the number or percentage of black students rose from 1% to 33%. So there was a huge change on campus, dynamics, personalities, power struggle around the political identity and future of the country. And I had the very good fortune to be a member and then a student leader of a youth organization, the YMCA in South Africa, and learning from my mentor, who was the professional staff person there, we were trying to work out how do we be part of the change? How do we engage white students to help them be open to the experience and perspectives of black students? And how do we, engage with black students in ways that we can show up humbly, show up aware of our own mistakes and limitations and history and baggage, and try and work out how do we make a new place in the university. And so that was really my beginning of it. And then over lots of experiences, I got more into working with organizations as a site of struggle and a site of change. So really now for over 35 years now it's been, in one way or another, I've been working with change through people, through the organizations where people are. And that's what I do. It's my passion. I enjoy it. I'm always learning. And yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with this.
I liked how you said, how can we make a new place? And just to note for a moment that I see several things that you and I have in common. One is Ireland. So a long time ago, I used to be an au pair there when I was a very young woman. And my parents moved to South Africa after their retirement, just around the time after Nelson Mandela came out of prison, and my kids were actually born in South Africa. So I like it always when I meet people and we have those things in common. Back to your practice as a consultant, Michael. So I am aware that you work both with private sector clients and with nonprofit and philanthropic clients. Can you characterize your clientele a little bit?
Yeah. Over the years, I kind of have clients from three sectors, right? The public sector, private sector, and nonprofit sector. The organizations that I tend to work with have in common that they have a social purpose, a social mission, right? So, for example, in recent years, I've been working a lot with some global pharmaceutical companies, financial services organizations, and my engagement with them has sort of seen and appreciated the ways in which they're trying to bring positive contributions to the world, whether that's in terms of vaccines or treatments for, diseases that affect many people, providing financial safety nets, insurance products, so that people can be supported at times of great risk, right? But the same with public sector. That's obviously got a broad social and public mandate.
Yeah.
And then with many of the NGOs, recently I've been working more with national focused here in the United States, but over the years I've worked with a lot of global organizations or international organizations. And again, common in all of them is working out how to make a positive contribution and a positive difference in the lives and experience of people around the world.
Yeah. So let's go into some of your points of view about change management and what you see in practice. So in a recent blog post, and we can link to this in the show notes, as well as in one of your other recent podcast recordings, you made several observations on myths that you see, that you observe leaders hold, and also mistakes they sometimes make when they are in the middle of change management. So I'd like you to elaborate on a few first. So one thing you say is leaders make the mistake of assuming rationality in change management processes. Tell us more.
Well, my response to this, I have a smile that is about self-knowledge We tend to write about the things that we've learned for ourselves.
Mm.
So some of your listeners will be familiar with things like logical frameworks,
Yep.
log frames, and as I was taught it, ZOP, which is from the Germans,
Yes.
right? And so in an early part of my career in South Africa in the 1990s, this very rational way of thinking about social change was a hugely dominant force. As the international bodies, as bilateral agencies re-engaged with South Africa after the end of apartheid, they were looking for South Africa to conform with the ways they worked with other countries around the world.
Mm.
And so they wanted these logical models being presented as a way of putting forward a funding proposal and then as a tool for project management. The NGO where I was working at the time saw this opportunity as a way of helping organizations understand this thing, how to engage with it in participatory ways, and to use it as a vehicle for organizational change, to
Mm.
bring rigor and robustness into organizational practice.
I
So
see.
I spent about 5 years really specializing in the training and facilitation of logical frameworks, logical approaches to project management. And I kind of look back at that now, and I think in some ways, yes, that was necessary to bring some clear thinking, analysis, things like that into the sector in South Africa, which had not had a strong tradition of that.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, that it can go too far in the opposite direction, that it can only be what's logical, what is permitted to fall within the certain boundaries, and you have to stay within that scope. So I think what tends to happen when we think about it at a broader organizational change level is that leaders think that if they can just present the need for change to their stakeholders,
Yeah.
the logic, the rationale, why change is necessary, people will see it and fall in line and be ready to follow them. And change is not only rational and logical. There's obviously very strong emotional elements to that,
Yep.
which, we'll talk more about this. I wouldn't be surprised around it can provoke resistance, right? But really, whenever we're thinking about change, we've got to really think about whole people. And people are made up of head, heart, body and hands, so thinking of one simple framework, so there's a part of us that is rational and cognitive.
Mm.
There's a part of us that has feelings and emotions.
Mm-hmm.
The part of us that has values, and a part of us that has a sort of an action orientation. We want to do things. So we've really got to think about how do we speak to all of those components of the people that are our stakeholders,
Mm.
and engage all of those aspects of people in the change that needs to take place.
Yeah, yeah. Two quick comments. One is I sometimes summarize that in a fairly simplistic way as the psychology and the power of factors in organizational change. And the other thing you mentioned, values, as part of what you said about whole people are part of the a change process. Yes. And then I would say in the sector of nonprofits and NGOs, I see an additional layer of complexity, namely that we meaning a lot of staff, leaders, board members, etc., have espoused values that we say we align with and that are very important for our identity, our felt identity, but actually at the same time, we are not disclosing our true self-interests. I think our sector, frankly, is rife with that. And it's something that I find very it creates another level of complexity because we're not willing to disclose our self-interest, yet they're very much in the room.
Well, I would just add one piece to that, is that I think there are, what's the right word I want to think about here? Values that we're supposed to have.
That too.
And values that feel icky, to use a technical word. Right? So, I've been working with one client recently, and the leadership feels very constrained on what they can exercise about the direction and priorities of the organization, because they feel that they have to pay attention to what staff want.
Mm-hmm.
So this element of participation and democracy and egalitarianism
Yeah.
is an unexpressed value in some ways that is really making it hard for them to exercise appropriate hierarchy,
Yeah.
appropriate power and authority, right? And so it's a balancing point that, you know, that you can either become too hierarchical and authoritarian, or I think sometimes also too participative and get slowed down by where staff are at and lose sight of some of the more strategic issues
Yeah.
that leadership can often see that aren't visible to staff.
I'm so glad you said that, Michael. I am completely with you there. You said also in the past that there is a reference for strategic planning and more generally an overconfidence in planning for change management. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I mean, again, my experience flows a lot from my earlier career around logical frameworks. I think what happens a lot of times is people think if we can work out what all the factors are and account for them in our plan and then follow the plan, we will be successful in change. And I think that is a mistake because we can never completely know and forecast and anticipate everything about the future. It's a fallacy, right? And even people who do that will very quickly discover they're off course, right? They need to make changes to get back on course.
Yeah.
As they think, rather than realizing, you know, the river follows where it goes and you need to adjust to where the river is rather than trying to, you know, impose your vision onto it.
Yeah.
You know, there's a number of quotations. And so the one that relate to this, the one that comes to my mind is the one from Dwight Eisenhower, who, as the leader of the Allied forces in World War II, said, I'm trying to get the phrasing right, something like along the lines of, plans are useless, planning is essential. And what I take of that is the process of planning is the process of engagement, of interaction, of sense making, of engaging with stakeholders, of grappling with what's the information available to us and what do we think we might do. And in organizations, that's really the process of coming to a alignment and coherence as a group around what's the work in front of us, what do we need to be doing, right? Trying to then put that onto a piece of paper. A document says this is the plan. It really reflects our understanding as of today. But typically, there's a gap between making the plan and implementing it, right? It might be a couple of weeks. In some cases, I've seen it be several years because it takes time to mobilize the funding. And yet people pick up that same old plan and now try to implement it, even though conditions are no longer identical. So again, I think the process of planning is really important, but let's not fall in love with the document because the document will be out of date and isn't going to capture all the nuances and complexities of the given situation.
Another thing that you said, and I want to just elaborate a little bit on. So misunderstanding resistance. And so this word resistance to change is probably one of, I've never done the research, the Googling, but if you looked at change management, you probably would, the next word would come resistance to change, right? And as you know, this is endlessly discussed within the field of change management, right? Is it that people are resistant to change because we don't like change, because we like habits and things to stay the same because it's more comfortable, etc.? Is it true that people fear organizational change? Or is it really that people fear a sense or have a sense of loss or a sense of threat, but particularly a sense of loss that often goes quite deep psychologically. Is it one of those over another, or is it all of this? But it's not only resisting to change per se. How do you think about that?
Well, I would say it's at least all of the things that you've named.
Plus more.
Plus more.
Mm-hmm.
So my approach to change is strongly influenced by my own training. And so I trained in an approach called Gestalt. Gestalt approaches to leadership and organizational change. It's a particular methodology, or not even a methodology, so a set of practices and principles that had its origins in psychology and working in family systems that then moved into organizational systems. The key idea that I want to bring from that to illuminate resistance is the idea that people work with energy all the time. And energy to keep things the same, energy to change things. But there is energy around us and how we are doing things, right? You might be familiar with the concept of a force field analysis.
Yeah.
So that was developed by a psychologist called Kurt Lewin. He was one of the founders of the field of Gestalt psychology.
Yeah.
And the idea of a force field analysis is a very simple but powerful and insightful one. So it comes back to energy or these forces. And the idea is that on any given thing, there are forces wanting to change it and forces wanting to keep it the same. Right? And so things often find their point of balance, homeostasis, but those forces are still present. It doesn't mean that they go away just because it's found balance, right? So whenever we're thinking about wanting to introduce a change, we might be thinking about wanting to make the force for change to become stronger than the forces opposing change, right? And so when we think about that, what does that mean for resistance? It means that in many ways, I think let me put it this way, people tolerate the status quo. I'm not going to say that they're comfortable with it because it may not be always ideal, but they're used to it. It's familiar. They know how to navigate. They know who to avoid and who to approach, right? So they know how to be in the current moment. And any kind of organizational change, a restructuring, a change of leadership, new strategies is disruptive to the status quo.
Yes.
And it's disruptive to the way that people have worked out how to be in this place.
Worked out how to be. Yeah.
Right.
In the beginning, I have to tell you, but I need you to change. When you start talking about energy as part of Gestalt, the Gestalt approach, I thought, oh, that sounds kind of woo-woo, which always then makes me kind of back off a little bit. But as soon as you started elaborating it, what is meant by that, I thought, yes, absolutely, very, very interesting and very, very relevant. I regularly work with Barney Talek in the US. He's a collaborator. He's a contributor also to our book, Between Power and Irrelevance, The Future of Transnational NGOs. And Barney, in his practice on change management, and for our listeners, there is an episode in 2020 that you'll see in the series with him. And he talks often about positive resistors and negative resistors to change. And it is really critical for leaders to distinguish between the two and not to mash them all up. So, he would say that positive resistors are people who actually embrace the direction of change that is being communicated, if you will, but disagree with the way in which the organization goes about it, while negative resistors resist the general direction of travel altogether, right, for the change. How does that distinction land for you in your practice?
Yeah, I recognize that description. I want to offer another framework as a way of illuminating this, because I think, yes, that it's often true that people want change, but not the particular change. right? So they might say, yes, this situation is not tolerable any longer. We need to do something different. But
Okay.
dear leader, that direction you've just announced, I don't think that's the direction we should be going in. I think we need to be doing something different. So that can then be, I think, a point of that positive resistance. Right?
Okay.
So one of the ways I think about resistance, and this comes from my Gestalt training, is a little framework developed by a Gestalt practitioner called Rick Maurer,
Mm-hmm.
and we can provide this information in the show notes.
Yeah.
He talks about 3 levels of resistance. And so, it's important to be able to recognize what's the kind of resistance we're facing, because each of them calls for a different kind of response.
Is this the one that you mentioned in another podcast episode where you something around, he has these very catchy short, like, I don't want it, I don't
That's right.
like it, or I don't like the person who is,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah.
So actually, I happened to bump into Rick a few weeks ago,
Mm.
and he told me the story of writing his book, where he was outlining these 3 things, and actually his editor came to him and said, these are great ideas, but the language you're using is a little bit alien to most readers. How about? And she offered him this shorthand phrasing that he said, oh yes, that absolutely gets it. So
But
3 levels of resistance. The first
yeah.
one is, I don't get it.
Oh yeah, I don't get it.
Right?
Yes.
Which is when people say, okay, you've told me this thing, but I'm not sure I understand it. Why do we have to change? Why change now? And so we can respond to that by bringing more information, more explanation, right? To help people get why the change is needed. So
Although,
that's
would you agree, though, Mike, if I can interrupt for a moment, would you agree that sometimes that also is used as a slowing down tool, right? Or as a tool to undermine to keep saying, I don't get it. You need to tell us more. We don't give
no,
us
I think the undermining piece might reveal itself in the next step.
okay.
But I think one of the reasons why people might say, I don't get it as a level 1 resistance is because leaders haven't given enough attention to communicating why the change is taking place, right? So if the first level is, I don't get it, the second level is, I don't like it, right? And so this could be undermining, right? I'm going to do what I can to actively oppose the change you're trying to make. Or it might be a form of the positive resistance you mentioned earlier. Yes, we need to change, but not this change. We need to make a different change. So there's a level around the disagreement is about what kind of change is needed, with there often being agreement that change is needed, right? So that's, I think, a point where as leaders, we need to listen and appreciate what people are sharing with us. It may be a case that our sort of stakeholder engagement was insufficient, and we didn't really take time to listen to people, or we didn't give them opportunities to have an input into the analysis and the identification of change, right? So it's a good, healthy resistance to have, right? Because it's not so much like slow down and stop, but maybe slow down, take account of this feedback, and then work out whether you need to modify how you move forward. The third kind of resistance is different again. So we've got, I don't get it, I don't like it. The third kind is, I don't like you. So that becomes the interpersonal dynamic. I don't trust you as leader, that you are doing something that's in my best interests or my organization's best interests, right? And so you're not going to win over support from people like that by giving them more information or by inviting them to contribute to selecting the direction, because they're suspicious about what's your agenda, what are your motives. Yes, you're saying restructuring, but are you really talking about staff layoffs, right? So they're really going to hold back. They're not going to participate, and they'll passively or more actively undermine what you're trying to do.
Yes. Okay.
And so what Rick says, which I think is so helpful, is don't mistake it all as just being resistance.
Yeah.
Distinguish what's the source of it. What's the concern that people have?
Yeah.
And then respond authentically to that.
Right.
as a way of either helping them find a way in, or to be clear that this is not for them, and then you know where things stand and you can move on that basis.
Mm. Interesting. I'm glad you told us a little bit more about Rick Mauer's framework. I had seen it before because you referenced it in an earlier episode that I listened to, but this is a good elaboration. So since we're talking about frameworks, and we are starting to run slowly out of time, so I'm gonna just pick one or two, and I'd like you to again riff on them in terms of whether you think they're relevant, what are the limits of their relevance, or where particularly you find them relevant. So one is, I'm not going to do the Bowman and Deal one. It would take too long time. But let me ask you about Leandro Herrero. So he and his team, they typically, this is the book on viral change, etc. They downplay the importance of top-down change management planning and communication. And Leandro Herrera would argue that change happens much more in a horizontal rippling out way, that it can be instigated at all levels in the organization, and certainly not only top down. And that it's also a framework in which the middle manager, for instance, is incredibly important. How do you think about Herrero's framework, that it's more about social proofing amongst peers and rippling out and viral change that way?
Yeah, I'm familiar with his work. I haven't read it deeply, but I kind of appreciate his perspective because
Mm.
it's provocative,
Yes.
right? And it's not, well, I mean, something I think is really interesting for this global audience. You know, I believe he's Portuguese, and his professional background is as a psychiatrist.
That's right.
Right. And so if you look at the vast majority of books about change and leadership and things like that, they
Yeah,
tend to come out of North America
absolutely.
and sort of often Anglo-Saxon
Yeah,
Europe. And they have a very common worldview,
yeah.
which, you know, there's useful insights that comes from it, but it really is a particular stance on the world. And so I think when we encounter people with different backgrounds, different professional training, they can often see and name things that, for example, me with all my privileges will often be blind to. I won't
Right.
see it for myself. I need that jolt
Yes,
to
absolutely.
make it happen.
Same for me.
So yes, where does change start? Well, I want to preserve that there is a place for top leadership-led change, but it's by no means the only source of change. It's not the only initiation of change. And particularly in larger organizations, you've either got a department leader or a team leader who can sort of see opportunities and can mobilize people around them. But if I think about my experience working, you know, in large multilateral organizations, you know, they're vast. There's many different components to
I
them,
know.
right? And so what it often takes is not necessarily one person, but a network of people finding each other. So they share that they have a similar technical training, a technical orientation of seeing things, and they find each other, and
Mm.
they become a source of maybe renewal about how should our sector work on change. Because I can be pretty certain that one person in a large system will not bring about change,
Right.
or at least not lasting change, because there's a limit, I believe, to the influence of charisma.
Yes.
But a network of people mobilized through connections, through relationships, through a common vision can actually be very powerful.
Modeling, diffusion, etc.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Finding different places to have influence. And so I think that's actually very exciting, because what I think it does is it democratizes the origins of change, that it doesn't have to live within the formal hierarchy of the organization, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even relatively junior people can have an influence on change.
And
Right.
so one question, and then, well, two questions actually. One is, so when I was asking the question, I was thinking about whole of organization change, but I was not talking about change at the level of one organizational system or one team, right? And I'm assuming your response just now was in that same, through that same lens. Yeah. Is it then a cliche to say that, because lots of organizational changes fizzle out or explode, implode, etc., that one of the factors that will influence, I won't say determine, whether change will stick is whether there is at least a bottom up or at least a horizontal layer to change throughout good segments of the organization, combined with them that is in alignment with, or finds eventually alignment with, a top-down stimulants, if you will.
Yeah, it takes all of that to bring about sustaining change. Leaders are important. You know, what I'm thinking about here, actually, when you think about change, organizational change, it's not so much about how do we structure our organization, or what's our strategy, or what's our theory of change, or how do we work in partnership with others. I think in many ways, the thing that will sustain change is what's going on in the culture of the organization. How will the culture shift and respond to what leaders are trying to bring about as a strategic direction, as a set of priorities? And so I think that's one of the sort of places where you're having to work simultaneously with both structure and process and culture.
Yeah, and
building skills of leaders to be able to role model and hold accountable people for the behaviors that you've set out that you want to, a way of being in the world.
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word behavior, and your answer just now made me think Rousseau did not do justice in this conversation to the whole topic of culture, which is one of my favorite ones. So maybe we can revisit that at some point in the future. I would certainly enjoy that. It's one of my favorite areas of work. I will just make a comment now and see how you in turn respond to that. I find in the nonprofit and NGO sector, the word culture, it's a little better lately, but has so often only been interpreted and defined as kind of values, principles, and guidelines. I'm not nearly as interested in that as in what are the actual day-to-day habits, practices, and behaviors, you used the word behaviors just now, that are either reinforced on a daily basis or that are discouraged or not reinforced on a daily basis. And the gaps between what we say we are about and what is actually encouraged and celebrated on a daily basis, right? Any kind of quick comments on that before we move to our last couple of shorter questions?
In the last couple of years, I've become more curious about this whole thing about habits and the power of habits to bring about change. Because when we talk about behaviors as at the sort of the basis or at the heart of culture, the behaviors that we engage in are the ones that are permissible.
Exactly.
Within the pattern of habits and ways of doing things in an organization. And I've led my own share of leadership development programs and leadership retreats and things like that, where people are genuinely wanting to do something different. But they return back to the workplace and they get captured by the patterns and the habits.
Yeah.
And it's not because they were just giving lip service to it. It's really hard to behave differently when everything around you is still doing it the old way.
Yeah.
So there's this interesting place. Actually, I'll say one thing. Again, this comes from a Gestalt perspective. When we're talking organizational change, we can select where are we going to intervene to support the change, right? And so we have a concept in Gestalt called levels of system. Are we going to intervene at the level of an individual, their behavior, their orientation? Are we intervening at the level of a team? Are we intervening at the level of a function or the organization or the sector, right? Sometimes we have to make a choice about where to enter, but the reality is all of those are being engaged whenever change is taking place. So I think it's actually helpful to approach a process of change, of knowing that it's going to have to be support for individual shifts and changes of behavior, but also then paying attention to the structures and the processes that support some behaviors over others. And, all of those different things all come into play, right? So you got to hold this wide open approach and working out what do we need to touch, what do we need to nudge, what needs support, etc., to help us move the change in the direction we're wanting to go.
Glad I asked that question. Okay, now I have two last questions and then a final close. So I'm looking for kind of a short answer because we are running out of time. What have you found, one, the most difficult or frustrating or trying aspect of consulting on change management across your clients?
I'm going to put it this way. I work with a lot of very smart people. I'm sure you do as well, right? They're leading in organizations or they're top technical experts. So they've had an advantage of a lot of education and training, and they've risen to, being at the sort of the top of their professions. And they think that because they're an expert in topic A, they are also expert in change management. Right. And so I think that's one of the things that is challenging, because yes, people are smart, but they haven't invested in, and their organizations have not invested in them, nearly the same amount about being a leader, being a manager, being a change leader, for example, that I've invested in myself, or that they've invested in their technical expertise. So we want to appreciate that they have a good perspective on the needs of the organization, on the needs of the sector. But they will most benefit by partnering with us as resource people, as consultants. We can bring them processes and tools and ways of looking at things that can expand what they have available to them through their own experience and talent.
If they're open to that, right? And you
if
said
they're open to it,
the curse of knowledge,
right.
In this case, the previous and technical knowledge can be a problem. And maybe linked to that is one, in your current practice as a consultant, what is one word most alive for you right now in your practice when it comes to change management support?
I think the word I'm going to use is awareness. And that works at different levels.
Okay.
But I think the path for change opens up when a group of people comes to shared awareness of what's going on and what needs to be done. When it's one person trying to push an answer or a solution on the others, you're going to have some of that pushback, resistance, and things like that. But when you approach change from the perspective of, and I'm working with a client at the moment around this, how do we get this team of people engaged, grappling with these issues, sharing different perspectives, being open to different ways of seeing things, and then coming to a shared understanding, a shared awareness, a shared appreciation? Then I think you have a better basis for moving forward together, rather than just submitting to one person's agenda.
I like that. Yeah. Okay, Michael. So how should people find out more about you and about Randel Associates if they want to have a conversation?
Well, I'd love to be in conversation, just like we have today. So there's two main ways to find me online. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. I post regularly, and you can contact me there through the direct messaging tool. You can also come to my website, and that address is www.rcachangeadvisors.com. And we'll have that link. Yeah, that's right. We'll have that link in the show notes.
Okay.
You can contact me through there, but you can also have a range of resources that people can access and download, a blog, newsletter, and things like that if people want to read more about kind of the ideas that I have and ways in which I can support them.
Super, super. And what we will do is look forward to a time when we'll talk more deeply about culture. And there's another topic that you know a lot about, and that is about certain forms of philanthropy here in the United States and what can be said about their efficacy. So looking forward to those future conversations. And so with that, Michael, thank you for all your insights that you've given us and given me a lot of new food for thought. And thank you, listeners, for being with us today. If you found this episode stimulating, then be sure to check out some other episodes in my podcast. There is the interview with Barney Tellick, who I mentioned, with Ed Boswell, and with Monica Maassen of Oxfam International, all change management specialists, sometimes internal to the organization, sometimes external. And you can find these episodes and more, not just on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org, with the number 5 in that, but also my YouTube channel. One of the things that I recently started to offer is if you've been wanting to have a kind of a one-off advisory call, but you don't have the budget right now or the time for a more sustained engagement, you can now book a one-off advisory call with me directly through my website, again, 5oaksconsulting.org. And if you subscribe to my email list, you'll know when Michael's podcast will be dropped. And you will always be the first to know about other bits of food for thought as well. So with that, I'm saying goodbye and see you all next time on NGO Soul and Strategy.